More often than not in Unsung Heroes, we tend to talk about cars from the motorsport world, or at least tangentially connected to the motorsport world in some way, where they tried to adapt racing technology for the street, for instance something like the Koenig C62 or a number of others. But more often than not we do talk about these cars which had really clever singular ideas or philosophies behind them, but then maybe had a couple of flaws, or maybe one ultimate fatal flaw, or just time and unforeseen circumstance which stopped them from achieving what they set out to do. On other occasions, you simply have something that's just crazy, like the Belleran's long-nosed Land Rover with its crazy huge engine. It didn't really accomplish anything, it's just a wacky car that I think is very cool to talk about. Now, as far as the cars in this series go, many of you have probably heard of this one before, and if you've played the Juiced games, you'll probably recognise the car because that's one of the only, if not the only game to feature it. There might be some random mobile racing game that features it, probably, but as far as console games, I believe Juiced 2 in particular is where you can find this car. Now, for those who maybe are completely unfamiliar with the vehicle, you're probably looking at it and thinking, that reminds me of a few things. Kind of TVR Speed 12-ish, a little bit of Marcos TSO GT2, maybe even a hint of Dodge Viper. So what's going on here? What is the Melling Hellcat? Well, first of all, what about the company behind it and the guy behind it? Well, the guy behind it is a Brit by the name of Al Melling. He's an engineer, and his company, Melling Consultancy Design, is actually one which you probably haven't heard of too much, if at all, and yet they're a very significant one. For two reasons, as an example. One, they helped Jaguar to win at Le Mans with TWR Racing, and in a production sense, they just so happen to be the guys who developed the engine block for all TVR Speed 6 models. So, kind of significant, you could say, and that would be a vast understatement. So, for the British performance scene, they are certainly a name that you should know if you don't already. But basically, Al Melling wanted what many guys who are really good in the car world want to do, and that is to make his own. And he wanted to make his own supercar. So in the early 2000s, he started to do that, and he developed this, the Melling Hellcat. Now, there are actually a couple of different Melling models that he attempted to build. There's also the Wildcat, and if you look at that car, you can definitely see the connection to TVR, the Griffith in particular, and we might cover that car somewhere down the line in this series as well. But as far as Melling models go, the Hellcat is the jewel, but it's also the unsung hero, because otherwise why would it be in this series? So why is it here? What did this car do, or what did it try to do? Well, put simply, he wanted to make it the fastest car in the world. And in many ways, many literal ways in fact, it could have definitely been the spiritual successor to the TVR Speed 12. Not only because of the connection of the company themselves to TVR, but also because of what he wanted from this car. I would not be at all surprised if he loved the Speed 12 and actually took a lot of inspiration from it, maybe trying to improve in the ways that the TVR Speed 12 itself failed. For instance, reliability on the racetrack, or actually achieving its quoted speeds, or even being in production at all would be a huge improvement compared to the TVR. Now, as far as Powerplant, no surprise from a company that makes great engines, it had an amazing engine, a 6-litre V10. Now, that doesn't sound like the kind of engine that you'd put in the fastest car in the world until you know that it's a twin intercooled quad turbo 6-litre V10 with over 1200 horsepower and a quoted peak torque of 880 pound-feet in a front mid-engine car with rear-wheel drive and a 6-speed sequential manual gearbox. So again, very similar to the TVR. It doesn't have the 7.7 litre V12, of course, but it's got that large capacity, many cylinder arrangement. It is turbo aspirated, of course, not like the Speed 12, which was naturally aspirated, and this car's torque actually matches up pretty nicely with the power of a Speed 12. But it's more so the style, that front engine rear-wheel drive approach, kind of a bare bones, raw hypercar or supercar, if you want to call it that, with the manual gearbox. And it goes beyond just that, because not only does it have similar specs, a similar layout, a similar appearance even, but he even wanted to take this racing, just like the Speed 12 did, although of course being in the mid-2000s, when GT1 was still a thing, it would have been a considerably different kind of GT1 racing to what the TVR was up against, with stuff like Lister and Marcos in the late 90s. This would have been up against stuff like the Celine S7 and the Maserati MC12. Would it have beaten them? Probably not. But it would have been probably a crowd favourite in a similar way to stuff like Panos, for instance. Now, as far as the car's performance, not too surprisingly for an overambitious British engineer, he completely overstated what the car could do. He had a quoted speed of nearly 300 miles per hour. Of course, it was never going to do 300 miles per hour. It's got the aerodynamics of a shoe. It's not going to hit that kind of speed, but with 1200 horsepower, it would not have been slow. And the similarities to the TVR don't end there, because the price would have even been a fantastic rival to the TVR, because, if I recall correctly, TVR wanted the Speed 12 in production form to be about £150,000, which would be fantastic bang for buck. This car had a proposed price in a similar region, about 180,000, and some say down as far as 100,000, but 185 is definitely more accurate, especially once you factor in production costs of a car with a custom-made engine for the car itself, carbon fibre body, all that kind of good stuff. So 185,000 would have still been fairly modest compared to the production costs. So ultimately, it would have probably been a failure from a business point of view, you could say. But from a performance point of view, it would have been great, no doubt, because it has the aerodynamics to be fast, not necessarily the fastest, but fast for sure. It certainly had the power and the torque. The manual gearbox would have been a pretty unique approach at that time in the mid-2000s, where you had stuff like the SLR, which was an automatic, you had the Veyron, which was a 7-speed automatic, BMW's M5 with the 7-speed auto. So to have this old school, but also racing-inspired 6-speed sequential, that's an interesting approach, kind of a Ascari A10-esque or Porsche Carrera GT in a kind of way. So, although the car never actually had the chance to shine, the original prototype, for instance, was built in 2006. I believe it was first shown to the public in 2007. They proposed it for 2012, but as of 2018 and pretty soon 2019, of course, the car still isn't here, so don't expect it anytime soon. Then again, the SSC Tuatara took quite a while, so you never know. Us Brits do have this knack for coming back to projects a long time later and trying to finish them, so maybe it will come, most likely not. If it ever were to come back, it would probably be a considerably different idea to what it is now, due to regulations, due to production costs, due to the market of the supercar world being very different now, to even compared to what it was 10 years ago. So overall, the performance probably is nowhere near what he claimed. Well, it definitely wasn't anywhere near what he claimed, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if this could have hit over 250. Pretty much 230, 240 would be guaranteed, based on purely the power and torque alone. Even with the aerodynamics of a brick, you could still hit that. 250, I think, was probably very possible, maybe 260, and that's being generous, let's say. So in the similar kind of ballpark to something like a Koenigsegg CCXR, for instance, or a 9FF GT9 at a similar kind of time. So it would have been a very interesting British alternative to the hypercar and supercar scene. And if you think about it, Britain doesn't really have any supercars and hypercars on that level currently. We've got like the McLaren P1, that sort of thing, but that's not a straight line machine. It's more of a track-focused, all-round supercar. I'm talking stuff like Veyrons, Venom GTs, Koenigsegg's, SSCs. Britain doesn't really have one of those anymore, and it would have been pretty cool to have a company which nobody had really heard of outside absolute petrol heads, and to get their name on the atlas, on the market of that kind of calibre of supercar. So ultimately, it's a simple case of the car not ever coming to production for no doubt a variety of reasons, but it's a shame because ultimately the SSC Ultima Aero turned out to be the spiritual successor to the Speed 12, which I'm very happy about. It's my dream supercar. But this could have been a much more direct descendant and spiritual successor to one of my favourite cars of all time, the TVR Cerberus Speed 12. So overall, that's it for this pick. Of course, stick around for more here on the channel, and if you haven't checked out previous episodes in this very long series, then of course you can click through here on screen at the end to see those. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.